Well, Miles, thank you very much indeed. And good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is just wonderful to be in front of a live audience. Normally I'm in front of a Zoom screen where people immediately turn off their videos and you've got no idea what's going on in their own rooms. But I can actually see you today, which is really rather great. Over the last 2 years, lots of things have changed. In my case, I've grown a grey beard, which wasn't there previously. My hair's got longer. I'm now wearing glasses, which is all a bit strange in some ways, but it's the new me after 2 years of lockdown. I wanted today to ask initially a very simple historical question, which is more significant? Is it the Battle of Agincourt, or is it the Battle of Castillon? Of course, if you're English and you're a great fan of Shakespeare, you're almost certainly going to say that it's the Battle of Agincourt that really matters. But if you're a historian, and in particular if you're French, you're likely to say it's the Battle of Castillon, which marked the end of the 100 Years' War, which is the more important. And the reason why I mention all this is that the history matters, and it matters in a kind of strange, subjective, mythical sense. It's not just the factual statements of history, it's what we believe in terms of the collective ideas that form some kind of nation state. And I think that globalization and the argument that globalization was an inevitable process somehow lost sight of this notion of subjective history. Of course, famously, Tony Blair said you might as well debate whether autumn should follow summer with regard to the continuous advances in globalization. But I think, in hindsight, Blair's comments were a little bit inaccurate. It turns out that there isn't anything that's quite inevitable about globalization. Sometimes it can advance in a swift and smooth fashion, but on other occasions, largely for political reasons, and in particular geopolitical reasons, it can go rapidly into reverse. Now, it is true over the last few decades that globalization has been driven forward. It's been driven forward by the collapsing cost of technology, on a belief in liberal, free economies, on a belief in open cross-border capital flows. But ultimately, globalization also depends on people engaging with each other, whether willingly or otherwise. And that sense of engagement, I think, is incredibly important and sometimes is forgotten about. Going back to the 19th century, you did have engagement facilitated by empire, for good or bad, but that was the model that worked to force globalization forward. And over the last few decades, really since the rise of Deng Xiaoping in China, the opening of China to the rest of the world, and of course the fall of the Berlin Wall, there's another kind of idea that facilitated globalization. And that was the idea that the Western liberal democratic model was the default model that all countries would embrace if they were free to make the right kind of choice. And of course this was a sense that we had reached the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama famously mentioned at the end of the 1980s. His timing, of course, was impeccable because his initial paper came out roughly at the same time as the Berlin Wall came down. But I think that in recent times this idea has been rather undermined because countries, people have chosen to disengage, that actually the process of creating liberal democracies all over the world hasn't really moved forward in quite the way that people had hoped to see. So just a few examples. The first is China itself, likely to be the world's biggest economy in the next few years. In fact, on some measures it already is the world's biggest economy. But tremendous economic success without having the liberal democratic model that the West has often assumed to be essential to the idea of continuous economic progress. The UK, through Brexit, has left an economic bloc, which I would arguably say was the defining bloc for the values of globalization, this idea of a free market in goods and services, in people and in capital. That's really what globalization is about, the idea of getting rid of borders, that you have this economic engagement that is free of borders. But the UK has walked away from a regional version of that particular story. The pandemic has led to, I would suggest, a greater home bias, partly because of differences in vaccination and health protocols in different parts of the world, but also perhaps a recognition that global supply chains, although incredibly efficient, can sometimes be rather brittle. And so there's a sense that perhaps that story is not working as well as it had done in the past. And as you heard from Mark, we're now witnessing a horrific war in the Ukraine in which from an economic perspective, there's suddenly a huge vulnerability in terms of cross-border energy supplies. Again, borders being rebuilt in the way that perhaps people hadn't anticipated a handful of years ago, but which is likely to have an extraordinary impact in terms of economic conditions in the months and years ahead. So what does all this mean for future economic developments? I want to raise sort of 3 points in my remarks. The first is that there's an issue about inflation. The second, connected with this issue of inflation, there's an issue about where we're heading with monetary policy and interest rates. And the third is really the big geopolitical question of where we're going to end up in terms of centers of power, political power and economic power in the world over the next few years. So first of all, inflation. There are many different theories out there at the moment as to why inflation is so high. One version, which was particularly attractive to central banks last year, who didn't want to admit that anything was going wrong, was that inflation was essentially transitory, associated with a few logistical problems with global supply chains as a consequence of the pandemic, and within a short period of time, these things would resolve themselves. The second version is that the inflation is simply a reflection of the energy shock, particularly as a consequence of Russia-Ukraine. The third version that I've heard quite frequently is the idea that the pandemic has led to greedy companies taking advantage of the pandemic and uncertainties to push through price increases that otherwise wouldn't have materialized. And I have to say, I think all three of these explanations are not really right. They're all very attractive in some ways because they shift the burden from one person to another. But I'd like to suggest that the actual underlying problem is that in 2020, when it appeared that the global economy was facing a sort of Great Depression type collapse, central banks panicked. They provided monetary stimulus far beyond what they needed to do. There was already a lot of fiscal help out there. And that huge monetary stimulus did lead to rapid increases, not just in prices, but also, importantly, in wages, led to incredibly tight labor markets, and actually the beginnings of what we used to call back in the 1970s a sort of wage price spiral. That situation, I think, is now looking much more problematic than it appeared 6 months or a year ago. And it does create, I think, an enormous headwind for economic progress over the next few years. The second issue on interest rates and monetary policy, well, I think that the consensus at the moment with regarding inflation and interest rates is not just wrong. I mean, the consensus is often wrong, but it's actually inconsistent. And the reason why it's inconsistent is that basically what most economic forecasters are saying is that there'll be a very modest increase in interest rates by the standards of what we've seen in the past, and that will be good enough to bring inflation back under control, back to target, within the space of a year or two. I'd like to suggest that that combination is unlikely to materialize. And there are two risks to this. The first risk is that, yes, inflation will get back down to 2% in 2 or 3 years' time. But to get there, you'll have to have much more aggressive monetary tightening than anyone is currently thinking about. So that's a pretty painful headwind ahead of us. And the second possibility, which I think in one sense is perhaps more likely in the short run, is that the ambitions politically to build back better, which are entirely understandable, actually preclude central banks from acting as aggressively as perhaps they should be to deal with the inflation. In other words, the inflation hangs around for a lot longer than forecasters are currently expecting. But either way, I think there's an inconsistency as far as the story is concerned. And then finally, centers of global power. When I wrote my last book, Grave New World, the subtitle was The End of Globalization and the Return of History. That was back in 2017. When the book came out, people said, "You're talking nonsense, it's never going to happen like that." I feel a little bit that it hasn't been quite such nonsense in recent times. Things have changed over the course of the last few years. But what I did conclude in the book was that there was a slight sort of Orwellian feature to the global situation. This sounds really horrific, but it's not actually that bad. Well, it is pretty bad, actually. And the Orwellian feature of this was the idea that, if you recall, in 1984, there are 3 regions of the world that appear to be always in conflict with each other, but it's 2 against 1, and the 2 against 1 are constantly changing through the course of the book. You never know who your ally is. You never know who your enemy is. But the three areas are Oceania, Eurasia, and East Asia. They suggested in the book that if you replaced those three names with the US, Russia, and China, you might have something close to how the world might evolve in the first half of the 21st century. Now, I have to admit that I had no idea about Vladimir Putin's designs on Ukraine specifically, but it does strike me that the world is moving in a direction whereby you have these strange bilateral arrangements that could quite possibly change over time. I think back to the 1950s and 1960s, China and the Soviet Union had an uneasy but, in one sense, sort of vaguely positive relationship. That all changed in the 1970s with Kissinger's famous journey out to Beijing and a sudden refreshing relationship between Washington and Beijing that hadn't been there previously, and you might say that the rest is history. But today, we can't be sure as to where China is heading, whether it will be closer to the US, closer to Russia, or go its own separate way. We can't be sure as to how the Russian situation itself will evolve. We can't be sure as to how the sanctions policies will evolve over the course of the next few years. There are tremendous uncertainties out there. And my parting comment really is this, that for the UK, 10, 15 years ago, I think if you were a Brexiteer, you might well have said, okay, we're connected to the EU has not been particularly dynamic. If we leave and join the rest of the world rather than focusing on the EU alone, we can get some dynamic experiences from countries elsewhere in the world that we should be engaging with. And you can imagine the list of countries you put together. You would certainly say, well, it's North America, Latin America. You would talk about China, India, maybe even Russia. But all these countries were up and open for trade deals. Today, it is much more difficult for the UK to pursue this kind of policy for the pretty obvious reason that we have a situation where your enemy's enemy is your friend, or your enemy's enemy's enemy is your enemy, and the whole thing becomes very complicated. But we're in a much more complex world than people might have expected. And the reason for the complexity is ultimately that we didn't really understand how globalization could both advance and how, in turn, it could also go into retreat. We are in a position now of retreat, and that, I think, does complicate the UK's position vis-à-vis the rest of the world, but importantly, it also emphasizes the need for the UK itself to emphasize the values of openness, of connections, engagement with the rest of the world, to effectively reflect the UK's own history over the last few hundred years, not quite going back to the Battle of Agincourt. So on that note, thank you very much indeed.